Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole, the 4th District of Oklahoma. It's another one of our weekly chats. This has been a very eventful week in Congress. But let me start off first with something of national concern that certainly Congress is focused on quite a bit, and that's the coronavirus and what the appropriate response to it is. I actually led with the chairman of the Labor H Subcommittee on Approach a Congress-wide discussion on this. And that discussion had Secretary Alex Azar, who's head of Health and Human Services, the head of the Center for Disease Control, Dr. Redfield, also Anthony Fauci, who heads the Institute for Infectious Diseases over at the National Institute for Health, and a group of other officials, transportation, immigration, Homeland Security, that sort of thing. And I can tell you the response, honestly, has gone surprisingly well. Obviously, this is a new virus. It's hit China really hard. It's an enormous country. Lots of interchange between our country and China, and actually China and other parts of the world. The Chinese government has been, frankly, more forthcoming and more cooperative in dealing with this than it has in previous epidemics and outbreaks, and that's good. The disease is still spreading. But 97% of the deaths that have occurred so far have actually occurred in a single province in China, and probably 67% of the people, the known cases, have been, again, in a single province in China. But still, the numbers are concerning. The spread is going to continue. The United States government has taken extraordinary efforts to quarantine incoming both American citizens and travelers from China. We're working with China to try and identify the virus, and the World Health Organization develop everything from vaccines to diagnostics, recommended treatment courses. So there's a lot happening, but it takes a while for all these things to get done. And while the disease is threatening, fortunately, it's not like Ebola. It has a significant mortality rate. 2% of the people so far that have been infected have died, so we take that very seriously. But the great majority of people will recover. Actually, the death rate is not much greater than the flu is, which we're just much more used to. We've actually lost many more people to the flu just in the United States so far than we've lost to coronavirus. I think this is something, frankly, that Congress can be pretty proud of, and the administration. Partly because Congress began preparing for this a long time ago. We've had 5 straight years of increased funding for the National Institute of Health, which we, of course, helped develop the vaccines and the treatment. We've had significant increases over that same period for the Center for Disease Control, again, with the idea that we're going to have pandemics and we need to be able to defend our own people. We've also put additional money in what's called the Strategic National Stockpile. This is the reserve of medical supplies and drugs and vaccines that we have available to deal with problems. And we created a couple of years ago something called the Infectious Disease Rapid Response Fund. It was actually something I put in a piece of legislation. That gave the Center for Disease Control money to immediately respond. All they have to do is notify us that they're tapping that fund. They did that a couple of weeks ago. They've asked for additional authority to move resources in that Department of Health and Human Service to this challenge, and that's been granted. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see a supplemental request. But our response was vigorous and I think effective so far as we can tell, because we were prepared. We thought about it for a lot of years and put the pieces in place for the United States to be able to respond, honestly, more effectively than any other country in the world. And that's something we ought to take a lot of pride in as a country. And frankly, both parties in Congress were involved in that. Both the last administration, the current administration have been involved in this. So this is something where I think the political system actually put the good of the American people first, responded accordingly, and we're seeing some benefit from that in this form of the fact that the disease is still less than 20 cases in the United States, no reported deaths in the United States yet. Now, again, those numbers will rise, they will change, but we're going to get through this a lot better than we would have if we hadn't been taking prudent steps over a number of years. So that's sort of good news. We also had this week the State of the Union address, very unusual address. I think the president gave a very strong, relentlessly optimistic and upbeat speech. There are a lot of touching moments. in the speech where individual Americans, including General McGee, a 100-year-old Tuskegee Airman. I actually met him a few years ago. At the time he retired from the Air Force, he flew combat missions in World War II, the Korean War, and in Vietnam. He'd logged more hours, combat hours, than any flyer in American history. I don't know if he still has the record, although I suspect he probably does. Just an amazing man, and it was very touching when his grandson was introduced ahead of him, a 13-year-old who aspires someday to be an astronaut. And then the president mentioned General McGee, who the president promoted from colonel to general literally that day. So it was a moment that I don't care who you are, you could rejoice in. There were a number of touching moments like that. Soldier returned early from his 4th deployment with his family and reunited. A young girl in an inner city having the opportunity for a scholarship to allow her to go to the school of her and her parents or mom's choice. And so I thought it was good. It was upbeat. Now, unfortunately, there was also some things the president took that disturbed Democrats. The president took a lot of pride in the economic progress of the last 3 years. The numbers bear him out. The lowest unemployment rate in 50 years. The highest consumer confidence in over a generation. Just literally today, it was announced we had another good month in January, 225,000 new jobs in America. That's much higher than the 160,000 that were estimated. So we're seeing real economic progress for all communities in America. Lowest unemployment rate ever for African Americans, lowest unemployment rate ever for Latino Americans, lowest unemployment rate for women ever. 72% of the jobs last year were created, and there's been 7 million jobs created by the president since his inauguration or during the president's term. Went to women last year, so that's a good thing. So again, our society's broadly participating. The president trumpeted that fact, took pardonable pride in that, and laid out some of his own policy proposals, things where he thought we could work together, infrastructure being one, trying to do something significant to lower the price of prescription drugs being yet another, the development of additional scholarships for young people. So, it's a normal address. There was a potpourri of options and suggestions by the executive branch to the Congress. Unfortunately, the Speaker was clearly not happy with the president. When you're in the middle of impeachment, it's not unusual that speakers and presidents don't get along. So the strained relationship between them was obvious. I've never seen a speaker tear up a copy of an address, which frankly is inappropriate because it's an official document of the House when it's handed by the president to the speaker. So you just shouldn't do that. I'm sorry the speaker chose to do it. There's already been a measure filed. Probably won't pass the Democratic House to deal with that. So again, the State of the Union was an interesting one and the kickoff in some ways for the presidential election year. Washington was buzzing over the Iowa caucuses, the inability to get an exact count, frustrating honestly to Democrats and Republicans alike. I think very unfair to the candidates that participated there, but it certainly shaped the discussion here in Washington. Finally, but frankly, much more importantly, the president was acquitted of the impeachment charges that the House had brought against him. It was basically a party line vote, just as it had been in the House. But of course, Republicans control the Senate, just as Democrats control the House. So this ended about the way that people thought it would end. That is basically united Republicans opposing impeachment, united Democrats supporting impeachment. I continue to think the exercise itself was not worth the time. It embittered the country. It was doomed from the beginning. And we just created a lot of bad blood and animosity. Now, fortunately, during that process, Congress got some big things done. It passed the USMCA, both the House in December and the Senate in January. I mean, major trade deal, big victory for our country. It'll create tens of thousands of new jobs, and tens of billions of dollars more in economic activity. The government was successfully funded. All the appropriations bills passed, so you're not hearing discussions of government shutdowns and disruption of vital services. So we can certainly legislate even in the middle of very difficult times. but there's no question both the tension associated with a presidential election year and then the impeachment episode make things much more difficult and make it much harder to come together. So hopefully this is in the rearview mirror. I know the tensions will remain high this year simply because it is an election year, but that doesn't excuse us of the responsibility of getting things done for the American people and making sure that critical services that we need when we have something like coronavirus outbreak are there and available and being directed appropriately to the benefit of the American people. So again, an amazing week. I expect a tumultuous week. Next week, in some ways, the president's budget is coming up here soon. There'll be quite a reaction to that. There always is, any presidential budget. We'll probably see that, well, we will see the New Hampshire primary results. Maybe I should say probably, because obviously we didn't see the Iowa election results, but frankly, I think New Hampshire, I actually know the Secretary of State in New Hampshire. He's a good personal friend of mine, Bill Gardner, a good Democrat, but a very good man. I'm very confident the New Hampshire primary will be exceptionally well run, and again, that'll shape politics on the Hill. But again, a very eventful week for what promises to be an extraordinarily eventful and turbulent year.